Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Every episode, we sit down to chat about the book read most recently by one of our book clubs. What did we make of them? Did they spark debate? And whether we loved them or loathed them, the big question is always, were they great book club books?
Today, we're talking about Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, a novel told by a large cast of characters that explores what happened when Abraham Lincoln lost his young son to typhoid fever.
And for our regular interview, I chatted with Michelle and Claire from the Feminist Book Club, who told me about how they like to mix things up.
In the beginning, it was a lot more of the classic feminist 60s text, the women's room and stuff like that. But then we've also gone to the theatre and seen plays. We'll have a film night and we've watched documentaries.
So stay with us. All that plus our usual recommendations for your next book club read coming up on the Book Club Review. Hi Laura, it's been a few weeks. The last time I saw you was at my book club where you were the surprise special guest.
I crashed Kate's book club.
Which was a special book club actually for us because we went to our friend Liz's house. She lives in Oxford. We got together on a Sunday, we went down by train and had lunch at her house, and the nicest thing about it was that actually we didn't all have to rush away and get trains.
Some of us had to rush away.
Well, but only after we'd had like a lovely few hours.
No. I ended up running for my train. It was a bit of a train debacle day, but with lots of really nice chat in between. Our listeners probably don't know that we met back in the day working at the same publisher. So I do know a fair few people from your book club, and it was nice to see everyone and talk about Lincoln in the Bardo.
Yes, let's talk about Lincoln in the Bardo. This novel is told through a series of fragments of reported speech and historical records, either true or imaginary. And Saunders has taken this tiny detail, this little footnote from history, which is the report that after the death of his young son, he was 9, I think, when he died, Willie, from typhoid. After the funeral, Abraham Lincoln went back to the cemetery to spend time with the body of his child. And so Saunders spins a story from this fragment of information about what might have been in the cemetery at the time, who might have been watching, what that state might be that Willie Lincoln had passed into, and put together this very, very, very unusual novel.
And that's the Bardo. Have you done any research into the Bardo?
Well, funnily enough, actually, our next book club book that we're reading is by Peter Mathiasson. It's called The Snow Leopard, and it turns out to be an extended meditation on Zen Buddhism.
Okay.
And this idea of the Bardo is taken from, Tibetan Buddhist thinking. It's an in-between space that you go to, and the form that your spirit will take there is based on the preoccupation that you had at the moment of your death.
Okay, right.
And Saunders has a lot of fun with this idea.
It's one of those books where, to explain it is going to sound a little bit mad.
It's quite hard
maybe
to explain.
even quite risque.
But so there are 3 main characters who sort of lead us through it. There's Hans Vollmann, who is a printer. He was about to consummate his relationship with his young wife when he was struck by a falling beam, that's right. And so whose spirit manifests itself in quite an interesting way as a result. There's Roger Bevins III, who committed suicide in despair after being rejected by a gay lover. And his spirit is covered in eyes that constantly search for all...
And hands, too.
Eyes and hands, reaching for all that is beautiful, the sort of beautiful detail of the world.
He felt great regret, I think, in the moments after he slit his wrists and realised that there was so much life to be lived and to be sensed. And this,
he says, I changed my mind, but of course, by then it was too late. And then there's the Reverend Everly Thomas, who in the audiobook is the character who's actually played by Saunders himself.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And he is sort of frozen in this permanent state of terror because he had this vision of judgment at the pearly gates and realised that his soul was going to be found wanting. And so as a result, he's in this state of shock.
He legged it. He basically ran as fast as he could from the pearly gates back into the Bardo.
It's actually a very, very, very funny scene, that. The way that Saunders sets it up. But so it's quite a hard book to take a bit to read, but I did just want to read the bit where the spirit of Willie Lincoln is sort of emerged from the sick box, as the coffins are called, and he meets Volman and Bevans and Everly Thomas. Bevans had several sets of eyes, all darting to and fro, several noses, all sniffing. His hands, he had multiple sets of hands, or else his hands were so quick they seemed to be many, struck this way and that, picking things up, bringing them to his face with a most inquisitive, little bit scary. In telling his story, he had grown so many extra eyes and noses and hands that his body all but vanished. Eyes like grapes on a vine, hands feeling the eyes, noses smelling the hands, slashes on every one of the wrists. Willie Lincoln. The newcomer sat on the roof of his sick house, staring down in wonder at Mr. Bevans, Hans Volman, occasionally stealing an amazed glance over at you, sir, at your considerable... Roger Bevans III. Come now, no need to speak of... Hans Volman. The other man, the one hit by a beam, quite naked, member swollen to the size of... Could not take my eyes off. It bounced as he... Body like a dumpling, broad flat nose like a sheep's, quite naked indeed. Awful dent in the head. How could he walk around and talk with such a nasty... Willie Lincoln. Presently we found ourselves joined by the Reverend Everly Thomas, Hans Volman, who arrived, as he always arrives, at a hobbling sprint, eyebrows arched high, looking behind himself anxiously, hair sticking straight up, mouth in a perfect O of terror, and yet spoke, as he always speaks, with the utmost calmness and good sense. Roger Bevans III.
A brilliant host of characters. And I think it's really important with this book that we do read something from it, because it reads very much like a play. They tell you who's narrating underneath it. So even now when you're narrating aloud, there's kind of a delay where you're like, oh, who's saying what when? And I listened to this book rather than read it on the page.
Oh, did you?
Yes. Have you listened to it?
I have. So I read it first, and then I heard a bit of the audio online, and I realised, of course, it's the perfect book to encounter as an audiobook because of the way that it's, as you say, it's like a play. It's reported speech, either directly from these characters or it's historical records, which are told in the same way. So you get the fragment of the record and then you get the attribution underneath.
It's really disorienting when you're first listening, as probably it is with any radio play, and you're not quite sure where you are and who you're listening to. But of course you come to recognise the voices, and then you sink into it, and then it really works. So for the first half hour of this book, as I was listening to it, I was like, oh no, I'm going to have to pick up a print copy because I just don't understand what I'm listening to and what world I'm in. I thought that the story of Hans Volman was Lincoln's own story, but then he died. It was very perplexing.
There's a little story about why I came to read this book and why I wanted my book club to read it. My mother-in-law's book club, who featured in our episode 3, I think it was, with Michael Walderman. So they were reading it, and she said to me, the woman who had proposed it had emailed round everybody because she'd started reading it herself, and actually she thought, oh my god, this is we can't read this. I can't defend this. And so my mother-in-law had asked me for suggestions. Oh, can you think of something else? And I was like, wait, this is George Saunders. No. This should be good. So that night when I got home, I downloaded it on the Kindle and I started reading. And I have to say, my first reaction to the first few pages when I started reading was, oh my goodness, I think she's right. I mean, it just makes no sense. It's bewildering. And also it's quite rude, and you're like, you just kind of don't quite get the tone of it, and it's very disconcerting. And what's lovely though, I just knew, I was saying to myself, I know this is George Saunders, I know this is going to get good. I had such faith in him as a writer because we had read his short story collection, The 10th of December, for my book club. I sort of encountered him a few years ago, and I knew it. That was an amazing collection of stories, so I knew it would be good. And sure enough, you start to get to know the characters and you start to understand their point of view. And once you do, then it all just falls into place beautifully. And I just stopped worrying about it after that. I let it carry me along. I think one of the issues with it that people in my book club had was it sort of slightly depends on the kind of reader you are. And some of us are more scientifically minded, or Liz, who's a barrister, she's trained to read things very, very carefully. And what happened was they were just getting really hung up on these attributions. They kept saying, well, was I supposed to remember them, or is there some kind of pattern? And actually, it's funny because my mother-in-law had the same issue. I remember she said to me, I just keep getting interrupted by these names and not knowing who they are, which is funny because I was just the opposite. I mean, I'm so sort of blithe. You basically give me a good story and I will just swim through anything. I'm very...
It'll make sense eventually.
It didn't bother me. And I thought he did a good job because he has this big cast of characters. I thought he did a really good job of making their voices different so that actually you do have a sense they're not all the same.
And of course, I had another level of interpretation because they were obviously not the same person, because each of the main characters, not even the main, basically any of the characters, I think, had their own actor voicing them.
One of the themes I thought that worked really well in this novel was the idea of points of view and inhabiting different points of view. And I think George Saunders has a kind of ongoing preoccupation with empathy. I think he's very interested in human psychology. And Amanda said she felt he had an almost uncanny grasp of human psychology in a way that's quite unsettling when you read it. And certainly I had that feeling I just love so much when I come across it in something I'm reading, where I felt known and understood. And sometimes these are things that you couldn't even imagine articulating, but yet there they are on the page. And I think that's his genius, and that was so magical, and it comes across in much of his writing, actually. And so I think the pleasure here for me was just being able to see that in an extended form. It's still a short novel, but it's satisfying.
It's really satisfying. You wouldn't think that much could happen in one night in a graveyard, but actually there's moments where it really reads almost like an action thriller. There's some high drama.
It's interesting that we haven't really talked about Abraham Lincoln that much, and yet he is supposedly the central focus of the story. And there is quite a lot about Lincoln. There are these historical records that tell of the events leading up to the death of the boy. There was a state dinner that they were having in the White House that night. And so there's just this awful scene of this sort of merriment and frivolity going on in this building, while at the same time this child is dying upstairs, and his poor parents kind of torn between the two.
Yeah, and the significance of the ball, because it's the Civil War. I think there's just been some horrific battles, and they're needing to keep up morale and keep people on side.
Yes, and so then this really interesting, the wider political implications of the Civil War, and then the suggestion that somehow in losing his own son, Lincoln might have been brought to a keener awareness of the many hundreds of thousands of young men, but often boys as well, who were going out there and who were dying on the battlefields. So there's some very serious themes running through this. And the thing about the historical records is that they often tell the same fragment of information, but from different points of view. What you see is that there's a real subjectivity there. No two accounts are the same. And so that's really interesting, because it's sort of making a point about history and how do we know what we know? How do we know what's true and what isn't?
I was really surprised when I found out at book club that not all of these sources were historical sources. And I remember someone saying, maybe we just don't have that much patience for that anymore. Like, it makes us a bit uneasy in this day where we have like fake news and real news. I think you were a bit more relaxed about that. You thought it was part of the tapestry of this book.
Yes, I think that's a really good way. I couldn't have summed it up better myself. Did I say that on the day?
Definitely. Very articulate.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because our last book we read was Colson Whitehead, The Underground Railroad, where the fact that the historical sources did seem to have been made up really troubled me. Whereas in this, I don't know, it felt so much less ambiguous what it was. It was a sort of fantasy, and so I suppose I wasn't as troubled by... I thought the historical records were true, and it was only towards the end, there were so many of them, that I started to think, no one could possibly glean this much information. Surely it was just the sheer quantity that made me start to think. And then I read, I think, or heard him speak in an interview, and I think he said that, some of them are his own imaginings of what people might have said. But then I sort of liked it all the more for that, because again, it's introducing different voices and different perspectives, and it feels like he's calling up these people from history, and they're standing and speaking as if they were right next to you, and there's something really wonderful about that. Funnily enough, Natalie in our book club, I think she enjoyed it, but she did say that she just didn't feel like it had to be about Lincoln. And that actually for her, that was quite distracting, that it was based on this true historical figure, because I think what she was saying is that the point about the father grieving for the child and then the idea of other spirits who are perhaps in some kind of in-between state was all incredibly moving. But, you know, why did it have to be about Abraham Lincoln?
I'm often like that. With the Underground Railroad, you know, I was a bit skeptical of that device of having a real train line running under the American states. So I can be a real skeptic, and I see where Natalie's coming from. But for me, the story was so much richer because they could weave in the significant events that are happening beyond the graveyard and which these souls don't know anything about.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the other thing that came across was we discussed the tone of it. It has this kind of miraculous balance between really this sort of devastating subject of this father mourning this much loved 9-year-old boy, and at the same time it's just very, very, very funny, and often in the same sentence.
Yeah,
it can make you want to cry, and also it makes you want to laugh.
He's very good.
He is good. But I think it's coming back to that sense of being known. He knows what you're going to find sad, and he knows what you're going to find funny. And
yeah,
I mean, I wonder if everyone gets on with it. I wonder if for some people George Saunders is kind of, you know, just grating.
I've read a few of his short stories, and I found the uncanniness kind of just a bit unsettling for me, and I didn't really like them.
I'd like to meet someone who didn't like George Saunders. I would be really interested to talk to them about it.
Well, maybe especially this book, because I think this book has so much heart in it. It's slightly bizarre, but it's very moving, and there's so much humanity in all of the characters and in the story and in the portrait of a grieving father and in the imagination of kind of imagining this world and then the transition between them. Really good. I mean, I was there, but I still have to ask the question, was it a good book club book?
Yes, it was a very, very good book club book. I think because there was so much to dig into, from the way it was written to the subject to how we all felt about it, how it made us feel, what we learned from it. I think several people had a real sense. This very interesting idea that what preoccupies you in life is what you'll take with you when you die, and so you want to make sure that you're thinking about something happy, basically, when your moment comes.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, on a bigger picture, it's about achieving some kind of state of peace with yourself.
So that you're able to let go.
Yes, and I think that's what's lovely, is that, you know, the ghosts have to kind of go on this mental journey and you go on it with them, so that you learn something. As they learn it, you learn it. And it's so beautiful. I mean, it just holds up the world in this way that makes you look at it with fresh eyes. And I think anything that can do that is worth. And so I think
with a book club,
it was lovely because, we it was one of those nice ones where we all really enjoyed reading it. We all really enjoyed debating it. But actually, I think we all really took something, you know, away for ourselves.
And there were a few dissenters on the perfection scale.
Yeah, because some of us, I mean, we have a little ratings system out of 5. People are allowed to give half stars. But that's about as nuanced as it gets. But, you know, so there are 3 of us who gave it 5 out of 5, which...
What did you give it?
I think I gave it 5.
I gave it 5 too.
And Amanda.
Yeah. So, you know, if we had a few of the 3 stars, maybe they would give it a slightly more nuanced perspective. But I think we did them justice.
I think I tried to represent them. I have to write up, after every book club, I always write up our discussion on our website. And actually, I always have to try quite hard to make sure that I try to include everyone's views and not let the whole thing just be massively coloured by what I thought.
By your rose-tinted glasses
and
memory.
Yeah.
And what's that website for?
Reasonably practiced. Well, our book club is called What Katie Read, which is a bit of a silly name, but just because my name's Kate. So it's whatkatyread.co.uk, where you can look and you can see how well I wrote up Lincoln and the Bardo.
It's a really beautiful site with every book you guys have read.
I love it. And actually, I think this is a thing I would say to any book club, is try in some way or another to keep an archive. It doesn't seem that meaningful at the time when everything's quite fresh in your mind, but go forward 5 years and you won't remotely remember the things that you read, or you'll have a vague, did we read that? And it's actually really, really, it's a real pleasure to be able to go back and just see what you thought, or be reminded of what you thought.
We'll put that website URL in our show notes.
Yes. So great book club. Do please read it, whether for yourself or encourage your own book club to read it, because I think
and do persevere.
Yeah. Don't be put off by the first 15 pages.
Yeah. And the slight disorientation in the style. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
A really pleasing development in recent years is that feminism has become cool. But back when Michelle founded the Feminist Book Club in East London, self-identifying as a feminist could still raise a few eyebrows.
In 2011, a friend and I were discussing some of the feminist stuff that we'd both read. And it was a bit of a challenge because I said, oh, maybe we should start up a book club. And she was like, no one would want to come. I was like, yeah, of course they would. And I put an invite out on Facebook, inviting people to come to a reading. And lots of people turned up. And here we are in 2017, still going strong.
That's really amazing, especially because it feels like feminism has had a lot more mainstream attention in the last year or two. But you guys were really ahead of the curve. Has there been renewed enthusiasm? Do you still welcome new members?
There's always new people joining. And we have seen like more people joining because they're really interested in feminism. But yeah, we just wanted to discuss some of the ideas that we'd come across like in the books that we were reading and feeling that things weren't quite right in the way we view society.
And where do you meet and what are the mechanics of the group?
We meet once a month. Someone chooses a book and then they are the host for that month. So it means that we've all got to know each other really well because we're going to each other's homes and reading.
And Claire, when did you join?
I joined, I think about 5 years ago. I was having a feminist, it's called a debate at a party. I was party with someone. And one of the members of the book club, a chap called Adam, said, oh, I'm in a feminist book club. You might want to come along. And so I didn't. At the time, I didn't know Michelle or anyone at all. So I crept up one evening to North London. I turned up with my hummus and some pizza, which is what we snack on while we debate. And since then, not only have I read lots of interesting books, but I've made some really good friends as well.
Can you guys tell me about some of the books that you've read?
In the beginning, it was a lot more of the classic feminist 60s text, the women's room and stuff like that we read, which was really interesting. Because the group's quite diverse in their interests, the books tend to reflect that. So we read Doing the Dirty Work, which is more of an academic book on women and labour. But then we've also gone to the theatre and seen plays. We'll have a film night and we've watched documentaries. So I think one of the ones I hosted, Claire, was Dark Girls, and that's about colorism in the African American community in America. And we also watched Good Hair, I think, as well, which is about politics around hair, again, the African American community. We read The Left Hand of Darkness, which is more like science fiction, but it was also really interesting about gender and how individuals could choose their gender. We also read The Handmaid's Tale years ago because it's one of my favourite books, and so that was really interesting to hear what people had to say.
And it's probably quite gratifying how much attention it's getting now, just bringing the discussion a bit more mainstream in an accessible way.
Margaret Atwood is an amazing novelist, and she's always had genders really strongly, like female relationships and friendships is always featured in her work. And to see like everyone's talking about The Handmaid's Tale that's now on Channel 4, it's quite interesting because the book's probably like 30 years old or more.
And The Left Hand of Darkness, that was read by my book club too, and we really loved it. It's a bit of a slow start, but as you say, kind of Ursula Le Guin, that was written I think in 1967, and she was just thinking about things in such a sophisticated way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that was one of the books that was quite divisive, actually, because it was science fiction, because there was lots of made-up names and places. And I think that style of writing, some people in the group didn't really like it, but her exploration of gender in it, though, was quite interesting, and that got a lot of discussion going.
And Claire, do you have a book that you recall sparking particular debate or that made a real impression?
It wasn't a book as such. I remember there's one that, Michelle, you weren't particularly happy that we did very recently, which was, we kind of posed a question, which was, can you be a feminist if you're not vegan? And that actually came out of a documentary that was on BBC iPlayer recently, which looked at veganism and in particular, how it's the female animals that are producing all this milk and all these eggs and that are being oppressed, if you look at it that way. So we had a very interesting discussion about that.
I think people are interested in notions of gender and power, and that sometimes leaks into other things as well. And so it can be quite a useful springboard in which to interpret other things in the mainstream media. I'm not particularly interested in veganism per se, but there's other elements that I might have been interested in.
The next book that we're doing is The Power by Naomi Alderman.
Yeah, that one's been all over Instagram. Everyone has shots of the cover.
So I'm very interested to see what people make of that, because I'm also in another book club, which isn't, well, I would say that there are plenty of feminists within that group, but we're not a specifically feminist book club. And I'm interested to see whether the reading within our feminist book club is different in any way.
talking about feminism, and I think talking about lots of different isms, can be quite tricky because people can feel quite emotional about certain things. I'm definitely a feminist, but I get a bit nervous about entering a discussion, certainly with people who are probably much better informed than me. How do you guys negotiate any kind of tensions and differences in opinion?
I've always said that nobody's an expert. We're all learning. The whole point of the group, why it was set up, is because we wanted to read things, discuss it, and we all learn from each other. Like, everybody in the group is a feminist, but we all have such different ideas and opinions on reading the same text. Everybody's interpretation of it can be really, really different. And I think being a feminist is a learning curve, and it's quite difficult sometimes to be a feminist because people then have a certain opinion of you straight away. They assume what you will think and how you'll act in certain situations. And I definitely have been through different phases in my time as a feminist. I'm very much about the personal being political. I went through a phase of like not shaving any body hair because I just wanted to reclaim my own body. I was very, very heavily involved with book club, especially in the beginning years. But then as I feel more like grounded as a feminist, I don't feel the need to be as heavily involved. It's definitely got a life of its own, and now it just organises itself, and it's really nice that that still happens, and people have just become friends through it, and we'll go to completely separate events together, but then there will be stuff that's definitely to do with like gender and feminism that will go together as a group, and that's really nice.
And you guys have mentioned Adam already, so you have some men in your book club.
Yeah, we do. We were reading The Guy's Guide to Feminism, and it was decided for that particular book club, everyone had to try and bring a man along. So Adam's been a part of the book club from the beginning, as he's like a mutual friend of me and the girl that set it up. And he's very passionate about gender and always brought a very interesting dynamic to the conversation. And then several other men came to that particular group and then have been with it ever since. So yeah, it's been interesting.
And do you ever reread classics with a feminist eye?
I don't know. Maybe we have done. In the beginning, there was a lot more like learning about feminism. Now, I think we all are quite well steeped in understanding feminism, and therefore, whatever we're reading or watching, we are doing it through like a feminist lens, almost, I would say.
And do you have any recommendations for a book club looking to kind of dip into some feminist literature or feminist theory?
If people haven't read The Handmaid's Tale, then I would definitely recommend that. I know The Second Sex is often touted as like key feminist text. It's actually quite heavy going, and what I found to be much more interesting was the autobiography of Simone de Beauvoir, because you see from her own upbringing how she starts to have these feminist ideals. And personally, I always would recommend reading women writers and reading women writers of colour, and I did that for 2 years. I only read women writers and women writers of colour, and then writers of colour, to kind of like give myself a broad understanding of what do women write about, what are their concerns. And this idea that, you know, only men can write literature is one that I definitely disagree with.
And Claire, do you have any recommendations?
For a fiction book, I would say The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing. It's pretty hefty, but don't be put off by that. I've read that a couple of times now, and I'm definitely planning on reading it a couple of more times because there's just so much in there.
This has been really exciting, guys. Thank you so much for talking to me. A lot of good recommendations there that I think I'll try to push on my book club in the coming months. Thanks.
I'm a woman.
Yes.
You're a woman.
Yes.
Why do we feel a bit scared about feminism and the idea of talking to people about feminism and the idea of reading feminist books? Why is that so intimidating?
You know, I left not feeling intimidated, though.
She was very encouraging, wasn't she?
That was it. I left feeling really inspired and feeling like, you know what? I shouldn't be intimidated. I should educate myself.
Yeah. Listening to that interview, I was thinking, I just feel really uninformed, and I haven't really read any particularly meaningful.
I don't really think
I've
I have
never read
either.
Simone de Beauvoir.
And also what Michelle was saying, I think after the interview, is, you know, she wouldn't be reading feminist theory if it wasn't for the book club.
Yeah.
And so the book club was really important to her as kind of a means to get everyone discussing and thinking, but also to kind of commit to a feminist reading schedule. She was saying, you know, if I didn't have the feminist book club, I'd probably just be reading fantasy all the time. And I was like, hey, I love a bit of fantasy.
It was lovely, this idea that, yeah, as you say, they almost quite consciously are coming together to debate and to learn from those debates and to take away then something into their own lives. So yeah, it was inspiring.
And it made so much sense to me because I think book club is a really good safe space to have difficult conversations. And if you're reading feminist classics, those discussions might get quite heated. But even for anyone reading any book ever, kind of having to explain what you like about something to someone who really hated a book that you love, that's just good. It's kind of like a good social skill. That's what we're all about in book club.
The other thing I thought was important that I got from that interview was the pizza idea. I thought, how great.
Yes.
So with my book club, we have it at each other's houses, and actually we have a thing where someone cooks a meal. But it's true, not everyone is comfortable cooking a meal for a group of people, or maybe people don't have time because they're busy. And actually, I thought everyone taking, a nice frozen pizza that all could be just popped in the oven, or even just order in. It doesn't have to be fancy, does it? I think you do need food.
Yes.
I'm not a fan
to go
of,
with the booze.
Yeah, post-work, I'm not a fan of just drinking book clubs in pubs. I actually think that's a disaster.
Yeah.
I think you really do need food. But, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Go with pizza.
Some good recommendations in there as well. I like the tip to read Simone de Beauvoir's memoirs.
Yes, I thought that sounded good. I was wondering, I kind of had a recommendation for them. I was wondering if they'd ever read The Bees by Laline Poole, which is a novel I really loved, which is set in a beehive. And it's a matriarchy, obviously, but it's also this kind of oppressive police state that they live in. And there's a very strict kind of caste system. So it's about bees, but it's also about oppression and freedom, and there's a kind of ecological message in there too. I just felt like it might check a lot of boxes for them.
I think it could well be up their street.
Plus, it is a great beach read, and it's got a good heroine who you really root for. A lot more fun than Margaret Atwood. I've put in brackets.
Michelle's in very good company.
Yeah.
A lot of people love Margaret Atwood.
I know, I'm obviously wrong, and every time I hear someone say how great Margaret, I think, oh God, I must just read more Margaret Atwood and, learn to appreciate her.
So, over the next few months, you might see a few more feminist classics on my book club reading list. Inspired by Lincoln in the Bardo, here are a few more recommendations that you might choose as your next book club book.
It's not an obvious one to pick up on, but I was thinking about novels that are narrated by ghosts or feature ghosts. And I suddenly remembered Max Porter's Grief is a Thing with Feathers, which actually then when I thought about it has a few similarities with Bardo. It's written in these short fragments, a mixture of text, dialogue and poetry. And it tells the story of a father coming to terms with the death of his wife and the relationship between him and his two young sons as they all grieve and move on. And the spirit figure in the novel is Crow, who's an intriguing force, sometimes malevolent, sometimes kind. And I think Max Porter has something of George Saunders' ability to balance something terribly sad with this amazing warmth and tenderness and humour. It's a short read. I thought it was fascinating, beautifully written, really life-enhancing, and I think it would make for a great book club discussion. The other thing that came to mind, which is completely different, is The Snow Child by Yoan Ivey. Have you ever read that?
I haven't, no.
It's been around a while. It's a beautifully atmospheric novel set in Alaska. It's a couple who move there and they have a stillborn baby, and they end up making a snowman in the snow, and later they're visited by this pale child who stays with them. And what's really lovely about this book is the way the author just keeps you guessing until the very end. It's very sustained, that sense of mystery, and there's something really pleasing about it. And it's very sweet, it's very light. It might be just the sort of thing, if your book club has recently tackled something demanding and you kind of wanted a bit of a breather, it's just a lovely novel.
And I want to recommend Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas. Andy mentioned this at book club and said that George Saunders' kind of cacophony of different voices brought to mind Under Milkwood. And I went, oh yes, of course. It's a radio play. It was written to be a radio play, a great tradition here in the UK. But I actually saw it performed on stage many years ago now. It's really stuck with me. And it's the story of a fictional Welsh seaside village, but told through the voices of its inhabitants over the course of about 24 hours. And it's a great contrast to Lincoln in the Bardo because, of course, these are living, breathing individuals, but all with their own agendas and stories kind of as they play out across a day. I think you can listen to it, but you could also read it on the page, which might make it even better for some book clubs.
That sounds great. And before we parted company after book club, I asked our friend Amanda for a recommendation. And Laura's going to be happy because it's one of her favourites.
I think I've recommended it before, and it's just been longlisted for the Booker Prize. I thought it wasn't on there, and I nearly had a heart attack, but it is. It better make the shortlist, and then it better win it all. And if that's not enough build-up...
Well, we'll see, because it's going to be up against Lincoln and the Bardo, the Underground Railroad.
Well, the Underground Railroad,
What do you think?
No, the Underground Railroad can't win.
Well, we'll see.
Interesting.
It's sort of this. It's just the sort of thing that might win.
You do realise we still haven't said the book name. Should we hand over to Amanda?
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't miss the opportunity to recommend Sebastian Barry's Days Without End, which is set in a very similar time period to Lincoln in the Bardo, though in fact couldn't be more different. It's a lyrical adventure story of love. Some of it's incredibly violent. It's incredibly moving and poetic, and you just have to read it. It's got this sort of queer theme to it that is treated in quite an incidental way and yet makes it very surprising. It's a Western, basically. Now, I have never read a Western, but I'm pretty sure that's not a standard theme in Westerns. But the treatment of that, I think, lends itself to a discussion because all this is going on, and it does seem like that everybody around the main couple, and it's a love story and it's a story of family love, they seem not particularly perturbed by this, which may be historically true, but he treats it in a very low-key way, and it's not the main part of the story, which I think is worthy of conversation. It will provoke conversation, but also just the sheer pleasure of it is worth talking about.
I'm so pleased that Amanda loves that book as much as I do.
I'm not sure she does love it as much as you do. I'm not
Okay.
sure anyone likes it as much as you do.
Maybe no one loves it as much as I do, but a great book club read, I would definitely say. And if you missed some of those titles as we rattled through them, you can find all the books we mention in the podcast in our show notes.
That's all for now. On our next episode, we'll be discussing This Is London by Ben Judah, a journalistic investigation into the ethnic diversity of London today. Judah considers everyone from oligarchs to sex workers to try to better understand how migration is transforming Britain's capital city. The Financial Times Review called it a revelatory work full of nuggets of unexpected information about the lives of others. But what will Laura's book club make of it? Tune in next time to find out.
And if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast. Get in touch with us there or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? For now, thanks for listening and happy reading.
Summer reading.
So now we can talk. We can talk about Beloved.
Oh, we could talk. Yeah, I actually saw Beloved just over there, and was thinking maybe I'll borrow it. Although, is it a holiday read?
I would love you to read Beloved. So it just came up, didn't it? Because when we read The Underground Railroad, we kind of both of us felt a bit guilty that we'd never read Beloved.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then I was in Oxfam and I just saw it on the shelf and I picked it up and I just cannot tell you how much I love this book.
It's really good.
It's amazing. And I felt almost embarrassed that, you know, I'd waited so long to read such an incredible book.
Is it quite heavy? Because
No.
I'm such a coward.
Well, I think it's so interesting, especially having read it after The Underground Railroad, because it's just so much more nuanced and it's just packed with, every line is packed with so much, and yet it's not heavy reading at all. It's like you just sort of flow through it. She just writes in this effortless way. It's just a joy. And I think the fact that the subject is so serious, I mean, this is a novel about a woman who is an escaped slave who comes to a point where she would rather kill her own children than have them taken away and taken back into slavery. At that moment in her life, that seems like quite a clear decision to her. And this book explores everything around that, what might have made her come to that point. And then it's a novel, thinking about George Saunders, it's another one that's very much about experiencing different points of view. And actually the point of view in this novel is the black community, which is why it's quite interesting. It's not a kind of white versus black story. It's actually a story about different people within a single community and how they might respond when something happens. As I say, I think it's just so nuanced. And my friend Sarah, when I told her I'd read it, she said, oh, the thing about that book is it kind of spoils other things for you for a while because they're just not as good. And she was so right. It's true, it did.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit not guilty as such, but you've been doing some proper grown-up reading. I've been reading Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, which is I think 1890s, 1900s, but it's basically about three posh young gentlemen heading out for some hijinks on the Thames River in a rowboat, sailboat. I still don't quite understand it. It's very silly. The writing is very long-winded in a good way.
Is it funny? Because I think it was supposed to be funny, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be one of like the funniest books ever written.
Yeah.
It's really not that funny, but the writing has that kind of dry Jeeves style humor, which can be a real pleasure. I've just been reading it when I need something to kind of like clear my head before I fall asleep.
Oh, it sounds good. Sounds like a good summer read.
Yeah, I think so.
There's a thing, isn't there? You can't read. I mean, if I go through a phase of reading sort of serious literature, no matter how much I engage with it and enjoy it or don't enjoy it, then there's almost a kind of bit of a craving sometimes for something that you can just dive into and not have to think too much. You know, you kind of need, I think palate cleanser books are really important.
Yeah, I don't even know if I should confess what I've also been reading. You know, some of the books that live on my Kindle are just astonishingly bad.
I could never show anybody all the books that I have
They
on my
would not
Kindle.
believe that I ever read anything
I
good.
bet mine are more shameful than yours.
Oh, I don't know. It's pretty poor. I'm heading off on a holiday soon, and one of the books that Claire mentioned in the interview, The Power.
Yeah.
That's on my reading list.
Yeah. It'd be great if you could read it, because then I won't feel like I have to.
Oh, you don't want to?
Well, I just, you know why I've hesitated? It's just because I just feel like it's going to be one of those books where it's just been so hyped. And I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's perfectly fine. I've read actually quite a few other non-fiction pieces by her. She writes for The Happy Reader quite a lot. And
okay. Is she
and she's
Canadian?
good.
She writes Canadian or
writes
British?
She's British, I think.
Oh, okay. Because
And,
Margaret Atwood's her mentor, so I wondered.
Oh,
yeah. Uh-oh.
I mean, you know, that's impressive that she got Margaret Atwood to be her mentor.
Apparently Ursula Le Guin too was kind of like giving her encouragement. But again, this just kind of contributes to the hype. You know?
But
how
that,
can
you
you
see that,
live
and
up to mentors like that?
And then it's silly because then I get a bit like perverse about not reading books that I feel are being kind of really shoved my way.
Yeah, popularity contest. You can be a little bit uncertain.
But it's true that I've had various conversations with people, and so actually I think definitely it's a good book for just, you know, getting people talking, and I suspect it will probably make a very good book club book.
We'll see. I mean, hopefully I like it, because it's not a book club book, and I will be forced to read it after this conversation anyway.
Oh yeah, well, report
Won't
back.
be able to put it down.